Welcome to the History Unplugged Podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. James, ready to get your bottle of Madeira, make sure your musket is working, and put on your tricorn hat to join the Continental Army?
I am ready. Huzzah!
I don't know. If you were in the Revolutionary, do you think you'd be a Madeira man or a rum man? I guess it depends on class.
I think it would depend on the occasion. I like both of them.
Right.
So I'm not picky. Maybe some hard cider too. Sit down with John Adams and have some.
Did they have that, or is that more of a Civil War thing?
Oh no, hard cider was. John Adams used to drink it with every meal.
Well, we're going to get into a lot of beverages. There's a idea that I think John Adams gave up tea and went for coffee after the Boston Tea Party, and that's why we drink coffee. Kind of an urban legend, but a nice idea. But I think it's funny that with all the hard drinking that we're definitely going to see in this series, rum was so popular. And I get why, because of sugarcane in the Caribbean, but it seems something that's become sort of synonymous with girly drinks was what all these rough, the Swamp Fox and other people would drink between battle.
Yeah, it's like you said, it was just a matter of supply and demand. It was easy to get.
Well, they weren't picky, and they just went with what was available. So that's the revolutionary hardiness that we're definitely going to see.
Yes. And you know what else, too? It was part of a standard ration for soldiers. I remember reading a while back when I was researching this series they got so much beef sometimes, so much hardtack, and then so much rum. It was usually rum. Sometimes it was whiskey or other things, but rum tended to be the drink of choice.
Shoes, coats, other garments, not so sure. But as long as the rum is there, that's what will keep people's spirits up.
First things first, you got to have your priorities straight.
Well, yeah, we're talking all about the Revolutionary War. We previously spoke about it. And
we could branch out now, Scott. We're not one-trick ponies.
It's very hard to break off. Yeah, so in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the meta issues, which I like to do. But even before we do that, I want to ask you why you wanted to do this. This was your idea, James, and we did key battles of the Civil War. And we talked about why it's so important, and you can go back and hear why we think it's so important. But I wonder why you wanted to focus on this, because in some ways, the Revolutionary War, it's just not as sexy of a thing to study as other battles. It's World War II or Civil War generally. And the reason why is because the new revisionist histories have downplayed America's triumph in the Revolutionary War. Some have said that, well, it's due to environmental reasons, like malaria wiping out British forces, and it's kind of happenstance that America won, really. Or they'll say, Washington, good statesman, not so good as a battlefield tactician. So for different reasons, it seems like it doesn't really have this exalted place that it once did. So what gave you the idea in the first place?
Well, I want to push back against what you just said, if I may. I think what you said was true for a while, but I think it's making a comeback. I really think that the revolution is becoming more popular. You're starting to see a lot more books come out about it. For example, I could list quite a few. The biography of John Adams by David McCullough, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner and a bestseller. A lot of people have read it, or if they haven't, they've seen the TV series, which is excellent too. Of course, John Adams isn't all revolution, but he's a huge part of it. You've had biographies by Ron Chernow of George Washington, which has become the standard already in just a few years. And of course, Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton, not to mention the famous musical, which has really gotten a lot of young people interested in the Revolutionary War. And I think that's really cool. I know there's a lot of historical purists they don't like Hamilton, it's not realistic and it's not accurate. Well, some of it is accurate. A lot of it, of course, is not, but it's not intended to be. But anything that gets people interested in going and reading about the real story behind the musical or behind the TV show or whatever, I'm for it. We've also had a series of books by Nathaniel Philbrick. He's had one on Bunker Hill. He's had one on Washington and Benedict Arnold. Then he just recently came out with another one about the final months of the war. Things like that are bringing the revolution back to the forefront. Rick Atkinson has just come out with one called The British Are Coming. He had the very well-received Liberation Trilogy, a series of World War II books. So I think I think we're going to see more and more revolutionary stuff coming out. The question about why I wanted to do this one, there's several reasons. One reason is because, quite simply, the listeners wanted it. You remember we had some discussion about it, and people, thank you everybody that listened to the Civil War series and gave us some really nice comments. A lot of people said, great series. When are you going to do the Revolution?
Yeah,
So,
the people have
sure,
spoken.
no problem. We'll just whip it out tomorrow. But anyway, so I think there's a demand for it. There's an interest in it. I know longtime listeners will know that I run a Facebook group called American History Fanatics, and a lot of people post different things, and I bet, Scott, at least half of the posts are related to the Revolution. I just really think that interest is increasing in that. I think people are kind of getting tired of the Civil War in some ways. Not everybody, but some people. The Revolution is less controversial.
Yes.
You can't hardly post anything about the Civil War in my group without people refighting the war. It was about this. No, it was about that. And
States' rights equals slavery, and
just all this. You practically have to go online and break up fights. I have had to sometimes. Revolution is not that way. It's not as controversial. Not controversial at all, and for most people. But I wanted to do it partly because I wanted to learn more about it. I have been reading about the Civil War and studying it since I was in college, even high school to a certain extent, but especially college. So for many, many years, 30 years or so off and on, I've been studying the Civil War, but I've never really studied the Revolution that much. And so partly I just did it for me, Scott. And I knew you're the same way. You like to learn as much as you can. You like to learn new things. And so I thought, well, this would be a good chance for us to learn. Because as you know, you're a teacher. I'm a teacher. The best way to really learn something really well is to have to teach it.
Yes. And that's where I've learned almost everything and knew it very shortly before the students knew it when I was explaining it to them. So that's how it goes.
Yeah. And the Revolution has a lot of similarities in some ways to the Civil War, but also a lot of major differences. And so I think it's going to be fun to go through and kind of do some comparisons between the two wars. This is similar. This is totally different. Things like that. So those would be my reasons why I wanted to do this. And I learned so much. My research, I finished it quite a while ago, although I'm continually brushing up. But I read about a dozen different books on the Revolutionary War, and I learned so much. The problem is at my age, I have to read things again and again and again, or I forget them. So listeners, if I make a mistake, if either one of us makes a mistake, forgive us. We've done the best we can, but we just can't remember everything. Maybe Scott does, but not me.
No, definitely not.
You're a much younger man, Scott, so your brain is not as messed up as mine is. But anyway, we're going to do the best we can, listeners, to make this informative, but also to make it fun and entertaining as well.
Yeah, and for listeners, if you like the Civil War series, that really is due to James' Herculean efforts for research and getting way into the details. So my tricorn hat is off to you again, James, for also going in and being very thorough. And I think this will be just as thorough as the other series.
Thank you. That's the plan. I know it.
And I'm pretty confident it's going to go well. And before we get into all of those things, we're really going to telescope out and look at some of the big global meta issues of the 18th century, just so you get a sense of what the Revolutionary War was and why it's different from other wars. This is just one episode, but if you're intrigued by this idea of the world of the Revolutionary War, I recommend the podcast Ben Franklin's World with Liz Covart. She was a guest and she talked about Ben Franklin, the man himself, but she gets into all sorts of other issues. One idea I want to present before we look into the different aspects of the world of the 18th century. I had a guest on who was a descendant of George Washington, distantly related, like a great nephew. And he mentioned that something intriguing about George Washington is he's a man between two worlds. He was in this inflection point in history, the early modern era, they call it, from the 15th or 16th century up into the 18th or 19th centuries. George Washington was square in the middle, where on one side he's sort of this medieval man who has this knightly code of conduct, and you can see the dying wisps of chivalry in him. But on the other hand, he's a modern man. He understands Enlightenment philosophy. He is leading one of the most radical political movements that contemporary human history had ever seen. He's at the forefront of that, and he's not the intellectual giant of Jefferson or others, but he's in dialogue with all these Enlightenment ideas. And so the 18th century is very different, I think, from our vantage point in the 20th century, because when we looked at the Civil War, it's squarely in the modern period. The modern period is what historians talk about today, where we imagine the future as being something that human activity can alter and direct to where we want. The early modern period is different. It's not medieval. There is an understanding of human agency, but it's many of the older institutions, religious institutions, social institutions, the landed gentry, aristocracy are still very much in play. Technology is similar to the ancient past than it is today. So if we talk to a Civil War vet, they would still be very different from us, but I think they would be much more comprehensible to us than someone from the 18th century, where you still see kind of the penumbra, the aura of the Middle Ages around some people. So those are some of the changes. But anyway, on this episode, we're going to talk about the changes that lead up to the Revolutionary War in the world of the 18th century are changes in warfare and weapons, changes in government and society, changes in political philosophy and humanity's understanding of itself, changes in British government policy, and changes in the American colonies itself. So any thoughts about the early modern period before we look at the first thing, James, on changes in warfare and weapons?
Yeah, I think it's funny that some historians say the modern period, quote unquote, starts around 1500-ish, but I like now more recent historians are referring to an early modern and then a modern or pre-modern, because people in the 1500s and 1600s still thought very differently than we do today. But by the time you get to the Enlightenment and the late 18th century, the late 1700s, people are starting to think a little bit more modernly. You're not seeing witch trials and you're not seeing, people being executed for heresy, at least not very much, like you would have in the 1500s and 1600s. And wars over religion have subsided. The Enlightenment people are starting to think in terms of all men are created equal, which we'll talk a lot about that later, and things like consent of the governed and things like that, which really were not a major part of the conversation in the 1500s and 1600s. So the difference, you're going to talk about a little more about the warfare and weapons. So I don't want to head you off at the pass or anything, but by the Civil War, we were on the cusp of the age of mass industrialization, but we weren't there yet in the time of the Revolution. Things were still largely made by hand. You didn't have these factories cranking out thousands of muskets like you had in the Civil War, at least in the North and some parts of the South. So yeah, the thinking is beginning to become modern, but technology is still somewhat outdated, although there certainly had been some advances.
Yeah, and we'll get to that more in a little bit, but that's probably one of the main things of you don't have industrialization and coal power. But changes in warfare and weapons, I think that's one of the biggest aspects of the early modern period, where the invention of gunpowder, of rifles, means that you don't have to spend years training an archer like the Battle of Agincourt. Now you can put a musket or a matchlock rifle and then flintlock rifle into the hands of someone and train them relatively quickly. The size of armies absolutely exploded in Europe from the 1600s onward, where before it was a few thousand. Now it's tens of thousands of soldiers, maybe more. And this is really what leads to the creation of modern states and then large empires, which leads to the British Empire. And I should mention in combat, get out of your mind stupid Hollywood stuff where from Braveheart to Avengers Infinity War, every movie thinks that it's melee combat where basically two sides run across at each other. And then there's hundreds of little fencing duels, whether it's a bayonet in The Patriot or whether it's advanced Wakanda weapons in Avengers Infinity War. No, that's not how it works. Warfare hasn't worked that way since basically the phalanx was created in ancient Sumeria. So yeah, get that garbage out of your head. So what we're talking about in the early modern period is with rifles that you have the matchlock rifle and then the flintlock rifle. If you